This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
But it's really important to take the time and center the prospect and yourself to remind them why they took the meeting and what are the three things, and it's usually three, you want to talk about today, right? Which is usually something like, I want to understand your relationship to this university or this nonprofit. I want to understand where you are in your life, what's important to you. And then I hope to talk to you about your philanthropy.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Christopher Haight, Associate Dean for Development at Stanford University. Hello, Chris. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Hey, Jen, great to be here. Thank you.
So before we dive into our discussion on qualifying donor prospects, I'm wondering if you would share a little bit about your journey from grants to research and now Associate Dean at Stanford.
Sure. Thanks for asking. It's been quite a journey. I started in grant fundraising at this company in Rochester, New York called Grants Office. At the time, I was specifically working a lot on education grants. So working with public agencies, schools, and nonprofits in that sector. And it was actually an interesting time for grant fundraising because it was during the Great Recession. And so there was the Recovery Act at the time, and a lot of new grant programs were coming out from that bill. And so it was a really interesting time to just try to unpack what was happening and what was changing in this field. But from there, I moved into a role in prospect research at Cornell University. And my first boss was Marianne Pelletier, which I'm sure many people in the field still know. But she at the time had been looking for people who had more of a business education or business background. And I just completed a master's degree at the Simon School of Business at the University of Rochester. And so she was really intrigued to bring that skill set into the prospect research team. And so I joined Cornell 2012 and was in prospect research for 2.5 years, and then made the jump to the front line and also down to New York City in Cornell's New York City office as a leadership gift officer there. And then had done leadership gifts and then major gifts. And then most recently at Cornell, I had taken on a role building out a new team that was focused on discovery and qualification activity for all of Cornell. So our mission was really to turbocharge Cornell's major gift pipeline work. And then just last September, I made another big move and left Cornell after 10 years and came out west and joined Stanford University as the Associate Dean for Development with what we call our Dean of Research. And what really attracted me to this role was that it was pretty unique in the landscape of higher ed. It was an Associate Dean role, but not for a college or school. I oversee our fundraising team for all of our interdisciplinary research centers and units. And so we cover things from the life sciences to social sciences. We have things in artificial intelligence and data science. And so it was just a really interesting role to take on and work in this part of the university's research enterprise.
Gosh, that must be fascinating to hear about all the things happening, all that cutting edge research.
It is, though, being more of a social science major in undergrad, I had to go buy books about life sciences again because I had forgotten all of my cell biology. So whenever those faculty talk to me, I definitely feel out of my element. So I've been trying to learn again about the life sciences, especially.
That sounds wonderful. And of course, I'm fascinated by your task of ramping up qualification and what that means. For as long as I've been in prospect research, people have complained about identifying prospects, but then the development officer does nothing with those prospects, or complains that they don't get good prospects because, look, they called them so many times, they've called quite a few that have been identified, and no one's responding to them. So those aren't good prospects. Can you share a little bit about where you got started? Like, how did you bridge between research and the development officer? And then what kind of training was involved? What works?
Maybe some of the issue with gift officers acting on what, in prospect research, what we would say are great leads is, well, probably many things. One, there's a lot of things to do, certainly. So they're busy. I think also as a gift officer, you're responding to your incentives. And so the gifts that are active and close to closing are probably most exciting for a lot of gift officers. But I definitely was, and maybe this is part of starting in prospect research and then becoming a gift officer, always more excited by the people who no one knew about or who hadn't been called or no one had gotten in the door with. And I think that excitement comes from knowing this is true. If you can get in the door, if you can move that needle with the person, they're truly additive. We aren't expecting that gift. When you're doing discovery work, you're kind of always bringing in the gravy or the icing on the cake because it's not part of anyone's work plan yet. So I think framing it as an exciting piece and the growth-oriented part of the business can be really helpful. The reason we set up a team for qualification discovery was because we realized that really great discovery and qualification actually has to happen in mass. If you only reach out to 2 people on a list, the likelihood, as you alluded to, of any one person taking your meeting or even replying to an email is really low. So if you do those 2 and it doesn't work, and that's how a gift officer, interprets the quality of the work or how they should trust that product, that's not a good sample size, I guess is what I'm saying. And so we needed a team that actually could be reaching out to a ton of people, doing that consistently, so that we could actually get to the numbers and get the right amount of people in the door talking to us. That was why we set up a team. Our team was pretty substantial in size. Cornell had put in, it was 8 or 9 gift officers total to do that type of work. And so we would go out there and each gift officer was working to do, I think, something like 150 discovery contacts a year. So their incentives were finally aligned to the discovery. So anytime anyone, a prospect researcher, an events person, a volunteer engagement person would say, hey, I think you should look at this name, that team was actually very prone to say, great, give me names because we can't get enough of them. So we really did a better job of building the capacity to match discovery and then also aligning the incentives, because those gift officers, their incentive was how many new people are you getting in the door with as their primary metric. And the money was actually listed as a separate and a lower metric. So we prioritized the pipeline work, not necessarily the dollars work for that. So that's a little bit about kind of the thinking that went into that. And then in terms of the training, what we did with that team, because they were mostly first-time frontline gift officers, was invest heavily in how we support them. So we did training up front for sure, and people went to conferences, that kind of traditional as you might expect, but we actually built a training program that happened every week. So we called it our Frontline Active Learning, and we called it Active Learning because it was not based on presentations. It was not me talking at people. It was us gift officers engaged in role play. So we would role play with each other in front of a group and then give and get feedback. We would talk through tough situations. How would you answer XYZ? Sometimes we would do something as tactical as go around the room and say, how do you introduce yourself, your role, and set the agenda for the meeting? So we didn't even do a whole role play. It was just very tactical. I think of it a bit like if you're on a sports team, you do drills on different skill sets before you play the game. And so we did this weekly. We brought in other gift officers or other people around the organization to help advise us. It was really important that we set the ground rules that it's okay to be vulnerable. This is the place to mess up. This is the place to ask questions. Everyone should be giving and getting feedback. That's not scary. I think that was really critical to helping people learn and develop skills and get over the fact that sometimes discovery can be scary, even for the most experienced gift officer, because it's something many of us just in life would find uncomfortable. You're going into someone's office or their home who you've never met before, and you're going to go talk to them about possibly topics that they don't talk to their friends about, right? Where they put their philanthropic dollars. So I always say we have a weird job. And so we should actually take the time to unpack that weirdness and learn together. And that's what we did at Cornell with the discovery team.
Chris, you just described my sales training. It's
Well,
exactly what we did.
Well, that's great to hear. And I think also what we learned too is, people learn better together. So that's why it was a group too. And I think that's really important for people to think about.
Interesting. And I heard you say practicing just how do you make the first call, get that introduction, but also on that visit, how do you talk to someone? Tell me a little bit more about that. So if I'm going to make a discovery call, and this is where I get all fuzzy because I'm not really sure how it works in fundraising. I know in sales, I'm supposed to have an upfront contract. We start the call so that everyone knows what's going to happen and we're agreed on that. And then there's steps for me to work through the call, which sometimes it goes that way and sometimes it doesn't. Did you establish what should happen on that first call and maybe what should happen on the second call? How did they know what to do?
Sure. So for us, we did try to break it down as much as possible for what types of things you're going to want to think about how you say in a meeting. And I think that was very important. It wasn't a script that we all used. It was, here are the kinds of things you need to say, and then the kinds of questions or information you need. But everyone has their own voice and asks those differently, right? And as you alluded to, you can never really know how a conversation is going to go. Again, you don't know who this is. So you might end up with someone who's really talkative, or you might end up with someone who gives you one word answers, right? But what I'd say, some core elements that we said for a discovery visit, one of the most important things is that first minute of how you walk in, introduce yourself, your role, and set your agenda for the meeting. And so, you usually engage in some small talk, but it's really important to take the time and center the prospect and yourself to remind them why they took the meeting. And what are the three things, and it's usually three, you want to talk about today, right? Which is usually something like, I want to understand your relationship to this university or this nonprofit. I want to understand where you are in your life, what's important to you. And then I hope to talk to you about your philanthropy. And those are kind of general, the agenda items. And then we usually mapped out questions to think about that would help you get to those agenda items. When I worked at Cornell, it might be, tell me about how you decided to go to Cornell when you were a high school student, and what was your experience like? And then into the life, where have you been since Cornell, in career and family and personal interests? And in philanthropy, it's not, will you give to Cornell? That's actually not the question we would ever leave with. It would be, what do you care about? What do you think about when you give your money to a charity? Who else is involved in that decision? We want to understand how people think about giving before we ever ask them to make a gift. And so we did outline those questions, and we would always practice together about how are different ways you could ask that. What are you learning in the field? Again, getting back to learning together and being adaptive based on what people are hearing in their own conversations.
Was there a set goal? So we can guide conversation, but there's a destination there. At the end of that first meeting, what's the goal?
The goal for a discovery meeting, I always view as, you want to understand if this person's willing to engage with your organization in a philanthropic relationship. One thing I would differentiate is that the goal is not to get a gift in the first meeting. If you happen to get into a meaningful gift conversation or the start of one, that's great. But that in and of itself is not actually the determinant of an effective meeting for a discovery call. It's, are you willing to go on this process with me? And so when you work with a gift officer, it's exploring the different parts of the organization, understanding what different gifts do in terms of impact, and then deciding what's the right gift for you and how will you go about making that gift. Often you do have to explain that to prospects. Sometimes you get people who are very familiar with development officers and they might work with ones elsewhere. But if you do discovery work, a lot of times you're coming across people who've never had this conversation. They don't know what a gift officer is. And so we actually would have to explain to them, here's how this could work. It would involve us thinking about what are your top 3 issues or priorities that you care about. And then my job is to think about how they connect into Cornell, for example. And then we'll spend some time through meetings or maybe visits to campus. So you can actually explore that and see for yourself and understand what these parts of Cornell do. And so it's explaining that. So it's getting buy-in that they want to participate in that process. And sometimes you get to the end of that process and they don't make a gift, and that's okay. The point for a discovery is, do they want to engage in that process? And if the answer is yes, that's great. But if the answer is no, that still has a lot of value. So I don't think people should only say, oh, your goal is only to get yeses. Your goal is to find out who your prospects are. And if someone tells you no, they're not interested, that's valuable information, because that tells you something about where you should prioritize them in your engagement, saying they don't want to be engaged that way. And so you can then allocate your time and resources in much more optimal and effective ways.
Yes, that's so true. Disqualification is key, preferably very early.
Yes. Yeah. The earlier, the better.
What information is important for the qualifier as they approach making the first phone call or the outreach attempts and then that first meeting?
I want to see some sign of capacity and an email or phone number. I mean, I don't think you need much more. I would say this is a gripe I have, that some gift officers, if you ask them, well, tell me about like the kind of prospect we should be finding for you, and they want someone who has a giving record and who's engaged or has attended events and maybe gives to similar organizations. And my kind of sarcastic response is like, well, isn't that the dream? Like, we don't work in the perfect world. at the base level, I just want to know that there's some indication of capacity. And I think that could be traditional markers like your job title and where you work. It could be real estate. It could be association with a foundation or some other giving vehicle. But sometimes at Cornell, we would also just see people who would pop up and it'd be like, and their giving behavior would tell me something's interesting, right? So they've always given $100 and then all of a sudden they gave $1,000. Why did they 10x that gift this year with no one asking for them or maybe getting a mail solicitation? And so to me, that behavior was always interesting. And so even if I couldn't find anything else out about them, or maybe their job or their real estate didn't signal they're going to make a major gift, to me, it's still like, you know what, half-hour phone call or 45-minute visit, that's worth some time there to dig into and at least say thank you. I mean, at the least you're doing right by the organization. But there would always be these kind of hidden gems, and you would find out they can't give substantially, or they can give above their means for XYZ reasons, or they can't, but they'll think about a substantial planned gift. Like we actually ran into so many people with this discovery team because they were out there doing this in greater mass, where you ran into people who, yeah, we wouldn't have prioritized for outreach if we didn't have that bandwidth, but because we did, we could get to people who got into conversations about planned giving or other types of giving that make a big impact for us. So it's not expecting perfect prospects on paper before you reach out. It's, can you contact them? And is there some sign that there's interest or capacity there?
Managing expectations about these prospects, that's challenging. I'm wondering, before I let you go, what one or two things could a fundraising researcher do immediately that would help their development officers have success at qualifying new prospects? I'm suspicious you're going to say good contact information, but what else is out there?
One thing would definitely be to sit down with your gift officer and understand who they are. And just understand how they work, right? You almost have to be a gift officer yourself. You have to go understand how this person works and what are their preferences and what do they consider a good prospect on paper while managing those expectations. What I've definitely learned from my days in research, but also as a gift officer, is it's just easier to swim with the natural ingrained human behavior. So if you have someone who only wants to work finance prospects, and then don't give them lawyers, right? They're just instinctively never going to work the lawyer, even if the lawyer is the top of their firm and has great real estate or great assets. They're just unlikely to do that. So swim with the current. Don't think your job ends at the email. It shouldn't just be, here's 5 new prospects this week. You should be sitting down with them. I think that's the most important. That was what my bosses in prospect research at Cornell always encouraged me to do, is go sit with the gift officers, ask them how they do their work, and then you'll understand better what you can surface to them that's just instinctively attractive for them. So I think that's one thing to make sure people are doing. The second, how to, on this topic, I guess as much information as possible, but I think maybe just highlight the things that are exciting about them, right? It's saying why you think this person's great. It's not just saying, here's their capacity rating, but saying, they just got promoted or they just made a new gift or something. Just highlight to you what's important. Don't just assume that because you put it in whatever format, I'm sure every place has, that, oh, they're going to read that. Again, human behavior, they're probably not. So just tell them the headline and make it easily digestible. I think when you do that, people are likelier to act than not. I don't know. Those are some of the things. I think just get to know your gift officer that you're working with. Then obviously just make it easy. Let them know what you're thinking about. And if I could add a third, I guess it would be open to feedback. If the gift officers are not reaching out for the prospects you're sending, that's the moment not to complain about it, but again, to go ask, I'm hoping to get feedback. Is there something you're seeing that we're not on the front line, right? Like, what should I know as the prospect researcher to be thinking about and looking for? The door wasn't open before. I think that's a great door opener to a really strong relationship, is to say, what do you think we can be doing better? Or what could I share that would be helpful? And understanding where that disconnect might be for them.
Sage advice. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Jen. It's great to be here. And thank you for having me.
That was Christopher Haight, Associate Dean for Development at Stanford University, with fabulous insights and advice on qualification, that critical step between research and an active assigned major gift prospect.